Okay, welcome to Romance Studies 202. Today we're going to talk about Alberto Moravia's Agostino, and it is a great pleasure joining me for this conversation, my colleague Gaoheng Zhang of the Department of French, Hispanic, Italian Studies here at UBC. Gaoheng, thank you so much for doing this and for being prepared to talk about this text with us. I thought I'd just start with a broad question. How would you suggest starting to think about this book?
I would often start analyzing a text by looking at the opening chapter. And in the opening chapter, we notice that Moravia is really talking about two storylines, one with the mother and the other with the gang of boys that Agostino meets in this beach town. And for me, my first question when after I read the first chapter is, how come Moravia wants to put these two storylines together in one chapter? That is the chapter that grabs the attention of the reader first and foremost. So I'm trying to think, and for me, later on, I realized that the mother represents Moravia's interest in Freudian psychoanalysis, mother and son relationship, and the gang of the boys relationship with Agostino perhaps points more to Moravia's concern with class divisions, racial divisions, and they are more of a social communist, left-wing Marx type of concern. And I think this polarity, you might say, between Marx and Freud can sometimes be mapped onto what I believe also in terms of sexuality, because the gang of boys touches upon more of a homosexuality, whereas the mother's storyline touches upon heterosexuality in terms of how Agostino is introduced to these two supposedly opposite sexualities. And then we can also look at this polarization in terms of neorealism and fascist middle class type of novel and cinema. So that's sort of the direction where I would go.
There's a lot, isn't there, in this short book? So you're pointing out, in some ways, it's about a clash of worlds. They're at this beach community, Agostino and his mother, and Agostino meets this group of local kids, and they introduce him in some ways to another world. You're suggesting it's sort of passing from a sort of Freudian interest in familial sexual dynamics to a more Marxist interest in social dynamics. And that question of sexuality is present in both worlds, but it takes on a different cast. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the generic, because it's also a clash of genres. I think we were talking earlier before how that works out, and how we can also think about this in a broader context of cultural representations in Italy around this time.
Because, as you know, the novel came out in the mid-40s, right after the Second World War ended. And we know that at the time in Italy, the most important artistic movement was Neorealism. And Neorealism claimed itself in many artistic genres. But if we take, for example, Neorealist cinema, I think we can think better, because Neorealist cinema, as you know, emerged at the very end of the Second World War in order to oppose the fascist regime's preferred genre, which was called white telephone films. And the name of white telephone films referred to the white phones that supposedly middle-class families would own in order to indicate their status, social status. So our novel, Agostino, is from a middle-class family, and it's very emphasized by Moravia. And then we have the gang of boys who are sons of boatmen and sailors and waiters. And clearly there is, almost like that gang of boys to whom Agostino is more attracted to represents neorealist tendencies. And, the Agostino's almost aversion, willingness to distance himself from the mother indicates that distance from the fascist middle class aesthetics or lies, actually. So yeah, that's how I see it.
So yeah, I mean, we see the ways in which Agostino obviously has a very, very close relationship with his mother at the beginning. We don't know much about the father. That's all part of some previous life. But then he gets in part cast off by his mother, who finds this lover, but also kind of seduced into this society of boys. And then there's this older guy, Saro, and there's this moment in which they go out in the boat together. There's something very attractive to Agostino about this, but there's also a sense of danger, right? I think
Yes.
in that.
A sense of adventure. I think that's a featured theme in many of these coming of age stories. In the Italian tradition, perhaps students are most familiar with the recent movie and novel Call Me By Your Name, which features a teenager's relationship with a graduate student in his mid-20s, right? So there was a age gap. And then at the beginning of the 20th century, some of you know that there is a novel called Ernesto, and by one of Italy's most famous poets, Umberto Saba. And that in that novel, actually Agostino's theme recalls some of those themes because it's about a middle-class boy's attraction to a port worker in Trieste. So there, I think throughout 20th century and 21st century Italian literature, there is the theme about, relationship between men, but in this case, more of a boy and a teenager with an older man, older adult. Yeah. And
we were also talking about, or you were also talking about when we were talking about this earlier, the question both in these neorealist films and I think also in this novel, about, I don't know, in terms of the post-war reconstruction, a sort of generational logic, right? With the children or especially young boys seem to come into the fore in many of these in these narratives. Can you say a little bit more about that?
For sure. I think the clearest example is Rossellini's War Trilogy. The first installment being Rome Open City. The second one is called Paisa, and the third is called Germania Anno Zero. And in all three films, children, male children and teenagers are prominently featured. So in the ending scene of Rome Open City, the first installment of the War Trilogy, the message that Rossellini wants the viewer to take away after viewing the film is quite clear, and that is the boys are going to take on the responsibility left behind by the adults in the movie to contribute to Italy's reconstruction, because the boys are walking away towards San Pietro. So there is also a religious message there. And in Paisa is an episodic film, and in one of the episodes, which is focused on Naples, we see a Neapolitan boy's miserable life and how an African-American soldier discovers that. And the episode's message seems to say, these Italians are living in misery and American troops are coming to help them, right? And in the last installment of the War Trilogy, which is set in Germany, the boys, eventually, some of the boys commit suicide at the end of the film. And that seems to be Rossellini's increasing disillusionment with the boys' role in Italy's and Europe's reconstruction efforts. So Alberto Moravia's novella perhaps provides an alternative to these readings as well.
I'd like to hear about that alternative in a minute, because I think this is all fascinating. There's this sense that there is a transition or a transformation or even an interruption. And again, we were talking a little earlier, and I really loved what you had to say about just the first few paragraphs of this book, and how even the linguistic, the verb tenses that are being used tell us something or indicate something about this sense of the interruption of an old order, as it were. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, for sure. I started by saying how important the opening chapters and the opening paragraphs can be for a writer to establish their points. And I noticed that in the first paragraph and the second paragraph, Moravia used the past tense, which in Italian we call imperfecto, the imperfect tense. The imperfect tense in Italian is typically used for two purposes. One is to describe routines in the past, and one is to describe emotional states or simultaneous actions in the past. However, in the first two paragraphs, we're pretty sure that he describes the routines of the teenager and his mother. And I sort of interpret it because we were also talking about how we don't really know these two people's life in the city. And I kind of see it as, the use of the imperfecto to apply to their holidays as a continuation of their routines from the city life. And then on page 5, which is also the third paragraph of the novella, we have a time indicator, one morning, to indicate how the past tense now switches to passato prossimo. Passato prossimo is simple past tense. In Italian, we use it to describe one-time actions. And in this case, I will even describe it as a one-time action that disrupts the routines of the couple, of the mother and the son, to introduce to you the young man with the patino. And then Moravia goes back to the imperfetto very briefly on page 13 or so, just to establish, the trio's routines. And then he, in the rest of the novels, he essentially uses passato prossimo to describe one-time action, one-time action, one-time action. So overall, it gives me the impression that the beach holiday is an disruption, an interruption in their life. And, having read the novel together, you can also understand, the routines as a pre-teenager, and then disruption, and then perhaps establishment of adulthood began. Yeah.
So that's the question I'd like to finish up with about. You've explained how, on lots of different levels, in terms of genre, in terms of linguistics, in terms of, I suppose, theory, there's this sort of transition or interruption, right? The interruption of the imperfect and routines by an event or a series of events. The interruption of the genre of like the white telephone, sort of bourgeois form of representation with another form of representation of neorealism. The interruption of, I suppose, Freud by Marx, or forms of heterosexuality with other forms of sexuality. I guess my question is a really open question about the ending, which is like, what will happen? Will they return to those old routines, right? Is the holiday, as it were, is the book or the events in the novel this sort of moment of exception, and does Moravia, or does the reader think that the sort of old order will be reestablished, or is there really a break here? Is this disruption a lasting disruption? I don't know how you read the final scenes or the final pages of the novel in these terms.
Yeah, I think Moravia leaves it pretty ambivalent, but having read Moravia's other later works, I think he probably intends the novella to mean not a radical disruption in the end, that Agostino would still, similar episodes would still happen to Agostino several times before he eventually, gets disconnected or, gets to adulthood. Moravia uses psychoanalysis throughout most of his works, even in his travel works. So that's my guess. Yeah, and also looking at some of, one of the interesting aspects, but one of my, I would say, criticism about Moravia's writing is sometimes he over-explains the boy's intentions, particularly when Moravia wants to use psychoanalytical theories to explain. He over-explains the character's inner thoughts that, for me, takes away the pleasure of reading. He does it several times, in my opinion. For example, on page 73, even, he was essentially making a connection, correlation. It's about mid-paragraph, it's a long paragraph. But on page 73 is where Agostino is saying, Agostino quickly discovered how close the correlation between the two accusations was. And he came to the vague realization that this was a price he had to pay for being different and superior, like social superiority and moral superiority. So Moravia is now telling the reader explicitly how to interpret Agostino's psyche, which is very different from Elsa Morante's L'Isola di Arturo, for example, where also Call Me By Your Name, actually, you have to, the reader has to really make an effort at understanding the text. Here, Moravia seems to be explaining to himself and to the reader, and I don't know, maybe that is, to go back to your question about whether this is a radical disruption or not, I think not, because of these two polarities, then Moravia seems to be very invested in telling the reader.
I think that's an excellent point. There's a lot of telling alongside the showing, and I think, my sense was that his point at the end is how difficult it is in some ways to break away, to ensure that these disruptions last. But there's a certain sense of openness at the end. So to some extent, that's up to us as readers. Well, Gao, there's much more that we could say, but we'll leave it at that. This is a fantastic conversation. Thanks so much for bringing your insight and expertise and experience to bear. Yes, thanks for joining me in this conversation about Agostino.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you, John, for having me.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye.